a decade, 10 years. That's how long she carried the weight of what happened. Silently, painfully, with no justice, no apology, no resolution. And then one night, she opened her Facebook. There it was. A message. No greeting. No explanation. Just 5 words. "So I rape you." Those words, simple, brutal, and uninvited, cut through the silence like a blade. They came not from stranger, but from the man she had named all those years ago. The one who had walked away free. The one who was never held accountable. And in that instant, everything changed. Because what the justice system couldn't do, what a police report, a rape kit, and years of trauma couldn't move forward, a Facebook message did. This isn't a story about social media. This is a story about survival, silence, and what happens when the past refuses to stay buried. It's about a young woman who did everything she was told to do. Report it, cooperate, be patient. And yet, justice didn't come. Until a digital confession, 5 unthinkable words, broke open a case that had been cold for over a decade. This is the true story of Shannon Keeler, and how a message sent in the dark became the spark that finally lit the fire of accountability. Because in the world of true crime, sometimes the truth doesn't scream. Sometimes it whispers. But when you listen, really listen, those whispers become impossible to ignore. Before her name ever appeared in a headline, before courtrooms and news cameras and a decade of waiting, Shannon Keeler was simply a freshman at Gettysburg College. Just a girl with big dreams and even bigger potential. She was 18, confident, driven, an athlete with a competitive edge and a smile that made people feel at ease. On the volleyball court, she was fierce, focused, full of fire. In the classroom, she was sharp, curious, hungry to learn. She was one of those students professors remembered not just for her grades, but for how she showed up. Engaged, determined, alive. Her friends describe her as warm, the kind of person who remembered birthdays, who stayed late to help you finish a paper, who could talk about Nietzsche one minute and The Bachelor the next. She had the balance most of us strive for and few ever master. Gettysburg was supposed to be her launching pad. A small liberal arts college tucked into the historic folds of Pennsylvania, picturesque, peaceful, safe. The kind of campus where people leave doors unlocked and friendships are made in dorm lounges at 2 a.m. Shannon was just beginning her journey there. She had plans, study abroad, law school, a career advocating for people who couldn't always advocate for themselves. She talked about becoming a public defender, maybe one day starting her own nonprofit. There was a light in her, a clarity of purpose. She knew who she was. But what she didn't know, what no one could have known, was that in just a few short months, her life would split into 2 chapters, before and after. Because no matter how bright your light is, sometimes darkness doesn't knock. Sometimes it forces its way in. And when it does, it changes everything. It was December. Finals were over. The air on campus buzzed with a kind of electricity only college students know. The collective exhale after a semester's pressure lifts. That night, like so many others, was meant for celebration. The kind of party where no one worries about the next morning. Just loud music, red solo cups, shared glances across crowded rooms. Laughter spilling into cold Pennsylvania air. Shannon was there with friends. Laughing, dancing, just being 18. No reason to look over her shoulder. No reason to fear. But Ian Cleary was there, too. He wasn't a stranger. Not completely. That's what made what happened next all the more insidious. They had spoken before, shared classes, occupied the same college orbit. He was just another student, just another face. But that night, he wasn't. At some point, Shannon decided to call it a night. She didn't want to stay too late. She asked a friend to walk her back to her dorm, a simple precaution. Something women are taught from the moment they're old enough to understand danger. Never walk home alone. She made it back. She locked her door. She was safe. Or so she thought. Then a knock. Not loud. Not urgent. Just a knock. Shannon opened it. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was that college familiarity, the belief that a knock in a dorm hallway is never cause for alarm. But that knock would shatter everything. Ian pushed his way in, and Shannon's world tilted on its axis. He didn't belong there. She hadn't invited him. He knew it. She knew it. And then he raped her. In her dorm. In the place that was supposed to be hers alone. But Shannon wasn't silent. As Ian violated her, she found a way to grab her phone. With trembling hands, she texted a friend. Just 7 words. Get help. He's in my room. A cry sent through pixels and panic. By the time help arrived, Ian was gone. The room was still. Her body was shaking. But she was already doing what survivors are so often forced to do, holding it together. In the hours that followed, Shannon did everything right. She reported the assault. She submitted to a rape kit exam, one of the most invasive, painful, and re-traumatizing procedures a person can undergo. It wasn't just physical. It was clinical, cold. Every inch of her body became evidence. Swabbed, photographed, cataloged. She sat with police, recounted every detail she could. Time, smell, sound, where his hands were, what she said, what he did. She told them his name. She did everything the system asks of survivors. Everything. But what she didn't know, what none of us can know in moments like that, is that the system wasn't listening, and justice was already slipping away. After the assault, Shannon did not retreat. She stepped forward, trembling but resolute, expecting that the system designed to protect her would do just that. She gave her statement. She completed the rape kit. She named her attacker, clearly, directly, without hesitation. She trusted that justice was next. But justice never came. The district attorney, at the time, Sean Wagner, reviewed the case. He looked at the same evidence Shannon lived with every day, the text message, the forensic exam, her report, her truth. And then he declined to press charges. No trial, no arrest, no indictment, just silence. The official word was insufficient evidence. That vague, familiar phrase survivors have heard too many times. It's the institutional shrug that reduces lived trauma to a technicality. Even with a name, even with a rape kit, even with a direct outcry. Nothing. The Title IX process on campus followed, as it's meant to. But Title IX isn't built for justice. It's built for policy, for liability, for appearances. And at Gettysburg College, it became clear there would be no meaningful accountability. Doors closed quietly. Investigations fizzled. Ian Cleary left the school. Not in handcuffs. Not in shame. He simply transferred out. Slipped away. Moved on. And Shannon? She stayed. Not because she had to, but because she refused to let him take any more from her than he already had. But imagine that silence. Imagine the weight. You did everything they asked. You followed the rules. You told the truth. And still, they left you standing alone. Advocates at the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Rape, PCR, have seen it before. Too many times. They say this isn't rare. It's common. Especially on college campuses, where sexual assault is reported far more often than it's prosecuted. The national statistics are harrowing. Roughly 1 in 5 women are sexually assaulted while in college. But less than 10% of those cases ever lead to prosecution. Not because the stories aren't real, but because the burden of proof is so high and the will to pursue justice so low. The truth is, Shannon wasn't failed by one person. She was failed by a system designed to lose interest once the story stops making noise. So she picked up the pieces. Alone. She carried her trauma. Alone. And she waited. Not because she expected anything to change, but because what else could she do? Until one night, years later, everything did change. But before we get there, we have to talk about the hardest part of all. What it means to live in limbo. What happens after justice says no? What happens when the door you were told to knock on, patiently, respectfully, quietly, slams shut in your face? You carry on. Not because you've healed, not because it doesn't hurt anymore, but because life keeps moving whether you're ready or not. Shannon Keeler carried on. She stayed at Gettysburg College, graduated, excelled even. She built a career, found purpose, traveled, worked, loved, laughed. But beneath it all, the silence never left her. You see, trauma doesn't scream. Not always. Most days it whispers. In the spaces between breaths. In the quiet moments before sleep. It reminds you of what was taken, what was never returned. And without justice, there's no clean line between then and now. The wound stays open, quiet, invisible, bleeding inward. Shannon's life moved forward, yes, but it moved forward with a shadow. She tried therapy. She tried advocacy. She even thought about going to law school. Maybe she thought, if I understand the system better, I can stop it from failing someone else. But nothing could undo that night, or the decade of silence that followed it. Her family saw it, too. They watched their daughter grow into a woman with unshakable strength, but also a woman who had been taught the hard way that the truth isn't always enough. Her parents, once full of faith in the legal system, found themselves doubting everything. And every time the news covered a story about another campus assault, every time another victim was asked why she didn't come forward, they remembered. She did come forward, and no one came for her. Survivor advocates who later worked with Shannon say this limbo, this space between surviving injustice, is often the hardest part. Because you are left to carry something that the world refuses to see. You're told to move on, as if healing is a deadline. But trauma doesn't follow timelines. It waits, quietly, until one day it surfaces through a scent, a sound, a message. Shannon didn't know it yet, but a message was coming, and it would change everything. It had been nearly 7 years. 7 years since that knock on the dorm door. 7 years since she texted for help, sat under harsh fluorescent lights, and told her truth. To the police, to the school, to the world. 7 years since the silence answered her cry for justice. And then, out of nowhere, her phone buzzed. It was a message on Facebook from a name she hadn't seen in years. A name she never wanted to see again. Ian Cleary. Her stomach dropped. Her hands went cold. But she opened it, and there it was. So I raped you. 5 words. Nothing else. No preamble. No apology. Just the horror, stated plainly. Shannon stared at the screen. For years she had lived in that limbo, trying to forget, trying to survive. And now, her rapist had sent her a digital confession. But it didn't stop there. He kept messaging. I need to hear your voice. I'll never do it to anyone ever again. I know I hurt you. I was messed up. I didn't know what I was doing. Each message read like a dagger, reopening wounds that had never truly closed. But this time, there was proof. This wasn't just a memory. This wasn't just her word against his. This was him, in his own words, admitting it. So Shannon did what she had always done. She moved forward. She printed the messages. She documented everything. And she went back to the police. Only this time, she wasn't just reporting a rape. She was presenting a confession. Forensic experts examined the messages. They verified the account belonged to Ian Cleary. Verified it had been sent from devices connected to him. Verified he had typed the words himself. There was no question, no ambiguity. He had written it. And with that, Shannon's decade-old case came roaring back to life. Because sometimes justice doesn't arrive when it should. Sometimes it arrives when the truth refuses to stay buried. This time, the answer was different. When Shannon presented the messages, the confession, something finally shifted. The district attorney's office, the same one that had once declined to prosecute, reopened the case. It wasn't out of pity. It wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was because now they had something no courtroom could ignore. His own words. In June of 2021, nearly 8 years after the night that changed Shannon's life, the DA issued a felony arrest warrant for Ian Cleary. The charge, sexual assault. It was official. It was public. And for the first time in nearly a decade, Shannon had the one thing she never thought she'd see. Accountability in motion. But Ian Cleary was long gone. Not missing. Just elsewhere. After leaving Gettysburg College years earlier, Ian had gone on to build a life that looked, on the surface, enviable. He'd moved west to the Silicon Valley world of startups and sleek resumes. He worked for companies in the tech space. He was the type you'd find on LinkedIn, smiling in a button-down, calling himself a thought leader. But beneath the digital polish, he was hiding. Because at some point, Ian packed up and moved again, this time out of the country, France. A new life, a new address, a new escape route. But justice was moving now, and it had long arms. U.S. Marshals got involved, and then Interpol. An international red notice was issued, essentially a global alert to law enforcement that a person was wanted for prosecution, not just in the U.S., but now recognized around the world. Ian Cleary was no longer a student, no longer a former classmate, no longer a man hiding behind the silence of a dismissed case. He was a fugitive, and the hunt had begun. Shannon, meanwhile, waited again. But this time, the waiting felt different. Because this time, the system was finally looking for him, too. For years, his face disappeared from Google searches. No social posts. No updates. Ian Cleary had become a ghost. But justice doesn't sleep. And even when it moves slowly, it moves. It was April 2024. A quiet afternoon in Metz, France. Just another border town moment, just another passport check. Until it wasn't. Ian Cleary was stopped during a routine identification check. What the officers likely expected to be mundane, an identity verification, turned into a break in an international manhunt. Because his name had been flagged. The Interpol red notice hit their system. And just like that, after nearly 11 years, the man who had raped Shannon Keeler in a Pennsylvania dorm room was in custody, on the other side of the world. He was arrested on the spot. The story broke quickly. Headlines flooded in. But behind the breaking news, behind the official statements and diplomatic protocol, was a moment Shannon had waited over a decade for. He had been found. He was no longer an idea, no longer an unanswered message, no longer a ghost. He was in handcuffs. The French legal process began immediately, and with it, the dance of extradition. It wasn't instant. Nothing ever is in international law. But U.S. prosecutors pressed forward. Cleary tried to fight it. His legal team argued against extradition. He wanted bail. But the court in France denied it. Why? Because they knew what Shannon knew all too well. Ian Cleary was a flight risk. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't some outdated accusation. This was a man with the resources to run and the history to prove he would. So they kept him. And 9 months later, in January 2025, Ian Cleary was escorted back to the United States under federal custody. He was flown across the Atlantic and delivered to Pennsylvania, to the very state he had fled, the very system he thought he'd escaped. For the first time since 2013, Shannon Keeler's rapist was within reach of the courtroom. The trial was coming, and the silence that had defined this case for over a decade was about to be broken in front of a judge, a jury, and the eyes of the world. 12 years. That's how long Shannon waited to look him in the eye, to sit in the same room, not as classmates, not as shadows in the night, but as survivor and offender, as truth and consequence. July 17th, 2025. It didn't come with a dramatic cross-examination. There was no televised trial, no moment where the world watched him squirm under pressure. What happened instead was something quieter, but no less monumental. Ian Cleary stood before a Pennsylvania judge, and he pled guilty to second-degree sexual assault. No denials, no legal spin, no dismissals of her truth. Guilty. The word rang through that courtroom with a weight no headline could capture. Not because it fixed what happened. Nothing ever could. But because, for the first time in a very long time, Shannon was heard. She took the stand to deliver her victim impact statement. 12 years of trauma, anger, silence, and strength condensed into words carefully chosen. Words not designed to break him, but to free herself. And in the middle of that testimony, she said this: the impact never went away. 12 years later, and still, It lived inside her, in her bones, in her breath. In every moment she had to explain why she was different, why trust took time, why nightmares still came. She spoke not just for herself, but for every person who has ever been told to move on, as if healing were a switch, as if closure were a deadline. She told the court that she had waited, that she had screamed into a system that once responded with silence. And now, she stood not as a victim lost in the shadows, but as a woman who never gave up. Shannon Keeler looked at the man who took so much from her, and she watched the system finally say, "You were right. We believe you. And we're sorry it took this long." The courtroom quieted, but the story was far from over. The guilty plea was a moment, a powerful one. But justice isn't sealed with a single word. It unfolds in chapters. And for Shannon, one final chapter still lay ahead. October 20th, 2025. That's the date marked on calendars. The sentencing hearing. That's when the court will decide how many years Ian Cleary will serve. Prosecutors are recommending 4 to 8 years behind bars, a sentence, they argue, that reflects both the severity of the crime and the years lost to silence. It's not a life sentence. It won't undo the trauma. No sentence ever can. But it's something. It's an acknowledgement that what happened mattered, that what she endured was real, that her voice, however long it took to be heard, was never wrong. In those final hearings, the conversation shifted. Because this case, at its core, isn't just about one man's crime. It's about how that crime was finally confronted. And that confrontation? It didn't come from a courtroom sketch or a dramatic new witness. It came from a message. "So I raped you." 5 words typed into a Facebook chat. Words that cut through years of legal dead ends and disbelief. That message was not just a confession. It was a mirror held up to a justice system that too often fails those it claims to protect. It exposed the gap between truth and proof, between trauma and timelines, between what survivors carry and what courts require. But most of all, it showed that in the digital age, silence leaves a trace. Confessions don't vanish. Words matter. And this time, those words changed everything. Shannon's case will now live on as a legal milestone, a case study, a warning, and, perhaps most importantly, a symbol. A symbol that justice delayed doesn't have to mean justice denied. The world will watch as sentencing approaches. Some will say the punishment isn't enough. Others will say it's overdue. But for Shannon, this isn't about vengeance. It's about truth, recognition, and peace. Finally, what does justice look like? Is it a courtroom? A sentence? A guilty plea? Or is it something quieter? Something more personal? For Shannon Keeler, justice isn't about erasing what happened. It's not about closure in the way people often expect. It's about being heard. Finally. Fully. In interviews since the guilty plea, Shannon has spoken softly but clearly. She doesn't use dramatic words. She doesn't speak with anger. She speaks with truth. Justice isn't just a conviction, she said. It's giving victims a voice. It's giving survivors the space to say, "This happened." And it mattered. Her words have echoed far beyond the courtroom. Survivor advocacy groups across the country have pointed to her case as a turning point, a rare example of digital evidence providing the exact clarity that survivors are so often denied. Because how many times has it come down to his word against hers? How many times have prosecutors walked away because it wasn't enough? Because there wasn't a witness, a photo, a confession? But Shannon had that confession. And that confession lived in a place where so much darkness also lives. In messages, in phones, in the corners of the digital world we scroll through every day. What this case teaches us is that confessions today don't always happen under hot lights in interrogation rooms. They happen in the middle of the night, in a Facebook message. They happen in text threads, in Snapchats, in DMs. And our justice system must evolve. Because the survivors of today aren't just telling their stories in police reports. They're finding evidence buried in the cloud, tucked into old backups, embedded in metadata. And the law needs to listen. More than that, it needs to be ready. Advocates are calling for reforms. expanded training for law enforcement in digital forensics, faster rape kit processing, harsher penalties for offenders who confess digitally and try to flee, legal protections that reflect the emotional reality of delayed trauma. Because what happened to Shannon isn't rare. What's rare is that she was believed eventually. What's rare is that the words typed by her rapist actually mattered to a courtroom. We need to make that less rare. Because no survivor should have to wait 12 years. No survivor should have to carry their truth alone. And no digital confession should ever be ignored. If Shannon Keeler's story moved you, don't let it stop at sympathy. Let it spark action. Because for every Shannon, there are thousands more. Thousands of survivors still waiting for their rape kits to be tested. Thousands who were told there's not enough evidence when they were the evidence. Thousands who were never sent a message because their attacker never needed to confess. This case, this one rare, remarkable story, is not the norm, but it should be. Justice shouldn't depend on a fluke message or a second chance or international manhunts. It should be swift. It should be thorough. It should be fair. And most importantly, it should be possible. That starts with policy. It starts with funding to clear rape kit backlogs, so survivors aren't left in limbo while evidence gathers dust. It starts with holding colleges accountable, ensuring that Title IX isn't a bureaucratic shield, but a system that protects and empowers. It starts with law enforcement training to handle digital confessions with the weight they deserve. And it starts with each of us. Listening, believing, supporting. If you or someone you know has experienced sexual violence, reach out. Help is available. Contact RAINN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network, at 1-800-656-HOPE or visit RAINN.org. They're there 24/7. They believe you. They will listen. And if you're in a position to help, whether that means donating, volunteering, or simply sharing the story, please do. Because change doesn't begin in courtrooms. It begins in communities, in conversations, in the courage to say, this matters. Shannon Keeler waited 12 years for someone to listen. Let's make sure the next person doesn't have to wait at all. Justice begins with listening. And listening begins right now. This story could not have been told without the bravery and unwavering resolve of Shannon Keeler. We thank her for her courage, not just in surviving, but in speaking out, in standing tall, and in holding fast to the truth for more than a decade. We also acknowledge the countless survivors whose stories remain unheard, unresolved, and unrecognized. This story is for you, too. If this story has both fascinated and horrified you, remember, true crime is far from over. In fact, the next story we're going to explore might be even more shocking. Make sure you subscribe and hit that notification button to stay up to date with more real-life stories that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Remember to leave your comment and thoughts below. The dark truths behind some of the most chilling crimes are just beginning. Stay tuned. The next story is waiting, and it's one that'll send a shiver down your spine. Thanks for watching.